This week we're going to start talking about emotional appeal, or pathos. And this is the third appeal, so we've already covered logic, that was SA2, and then SA3 we started talking about ethical appeal, ethos, and evaluating the ethos of the writers of those articles. So now we're going to start looking at how does emotional appeal work, and we're going to start with looking at some movie scenes, because movies are all about emotions. And so you can use emotions in movies, and that's kind of what the experience is about, but it also has a really useful purpose in persuasion. You can persuade someone based on logic, but emotion has a really important role to play. I would say there's two main ways you use emotion. So you can either motivate a person to take action, because even if you convince them logically that you're right, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do something about it. But when you get them emotionally invested in something and persuade them logically, then they're more likely to actually do something, whether it's go vote or spend their money on this or donate to this or whatever it might be. There needs to be some sort of emotional component before most people will take action. I will also say emotion can kind of guide what facts we choose to believe. How it makes us feel to believe something is true or not true can determine what facts we believe are facts, and that in turn shapes how we are persuaded logically. So you can use emotions to convince someone that this alternate reality is real, because it makes them feel safer or lets them have some righteous anger or something like that, and then you can make logical arguments based on those incorrect facts, and you're persuading them logically even if not factually. And so emotion plays a role in that as well. We're all very big on our own comfort, and that shapes how we see the world and what we believe to be true and logical. So lots of emotions can be used as part of persuasion. I think probably some of the ones you see the most often would be things like anger and fear, especially during political ad season, which we probably just got out of. Those are two of the most common ones you see. There can be more positive emotions like happiness and joy, and things like that, and that I think tends to be the more positive if we're talking about political ads, the ones that get you to connect with the person who's trying to get your vote rather than trying to make you angry or afraid of the other person or what will happen if they win. You see people use guilt a lot. Maybe you had parents or grandparents who are really good at that. My mom was a pro. It's like her superpower. Some that we might not think about as much as being emotions, but still are really useful for persuasion. There's sort of a pair called patriotism and emulation. Patriotism, we don't really think about it necessarily as an emotion, but that's what it is. So patriotism and emulation are kind of two sides of the same coin that are about belonging. So emulation is kind of the desire to fit in and belong, and then patriotism is the fear of not belonging. And people will use that as leverage to get people to go along with stuff. You're not a real American if you don't do this. You can also think of hunger as an emotion, even though it can also be a physical state. There's an emotional component to it. I think probably a lot of you can think of times that you or someone you know was not themselves, like the Snickers commercial when they're hungry. We actually spend more money when we're hungry, not even just on food, but it's an emotional state. And another one that gets used a lot is nostalgia. The idea of nostalgia is like the warm fuzzies we get thinking about the past, but specifically the past as it didn't necessarily exist. It's kind of seeing the past through rose-colored glasses and only really seeing the positives, and then that happy feeling we get thinking about that past, even though it wasn't actually like that. But that gets leveraged a lot in commercials, political campaigns. We're going to take things back to the way they used to be in the good old days. They weren't actually great necessarily, but we don't remember that very clearly. We remember the better stuff more easily, most of us. So those are just some examples of how emotion can play a role. And then if you're actually trying to get an emotional response, the easiest way to do it is to tell a story. Storytelling is a really useful tool for persuasion, because telling someone to be angry or afraid doesn't really work to make them angry or afraid. They might get angry at you for trying to manipulate them, but not really to actually get them to feel the anger at what you're trying. But if you can do things to try to put them in the situation so that they have that response on their own. So instead of saying, you should be angry about this, or you should hate this person because they did this, instead of just saying you should hate them because I hate them too. You tell the story about what makes you angry at that person, so that your audience can sort of experience that alongside you, not actually, but sort of feel like they have, and then they can have that same response toward that person. If you want someone to be afraid, don't tell them to be afraid. Tell them the story of what happened to you that made you afraid of this, so that they can be afraid of this too. And so in Essay 4, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some movie scenes and look at how do they try to get us to respond with emotion. So movies are telling stories, and there's a lot of choices they make to try to encourage us to have that emotional response. And so we'll talk about a lot of different things. It can be the things they do to help us connect to the character, and that can be through things like dialogue and acting, and even just the way that character is filmed and framed in the picture. It can use music to try to get us to respond with emotion, showing us what we should be afraid of so we can be afraid of it too. Like, all of these are different elements of getting an emotional response from a movie audience. But those are also really instructive in trying to figure out how do you do it when you're speaking or writing. And so that's what we're going to concentrate on in Essay 4, is how did the movies do it? And then you guys are going to do it in Essay 5. And then also in your final project, you're going to go back to that story you wrote for Essay 1, and you are going to try to improve how you did emotional appeal in that as your final project for the class. So that's Pathos in a